En las montañas del oeste de Carolina del Norte se alza una casa que no debería existir. La finca Biltmore contiene 250 habitaciones distribuidas en 4 acres de superficie. Tiene 35 dormitorios, 43 baños, 65 chimeneas y una piscina cubierta. Cuando George Vanderbilt completó la construcción en 1895, el proyecto había consumido 6 años y costado aproximadamente $6 millones. Ajustado por inflación, eso supera los $200 millones en la moneda actual. Ningún estadounidense ha construido algo remotamente comparable. La razón no tiene nada que ver con los cambios en los gustos arquitectónicos o la disminución de la ambición. El mundo que hizo posible Biltmore fue destruido deliberadamente a través de impuestos, regulaciones y la furia pública contra la riqueza extrema. Lo que lo reemplazó revela algo más oscuro sobre la desigualdad moderna. Los multimillonarios no desaparecieron, simplemente aprendieron a esconderse. En 1888, George Washington Vanderbilt II tenía 26 años y controlaba una fortuna que superaba el presupuesto anual de la mayoría de los estados americanos. Era el nieto más joven del comodoro Cornelius Vanderbilt, quien había fallecido 11 años antes como el hombre más rico de América. El comodoro había construido su imperio sobre barcos de vapor y ferrocarriles, transformando el transporte en todo el continente. Cuando murió en 1877, su patrimonio estaba valorado en aproximadamente $105 millones, más que todo el tesoro de los Estados Unidos en reservas de oro en ese momento. La fortuna pasó principalmente al hijo del comodoro, William Henry Vanderbilt, quien demostró ser aún más capaz que su padre. William duplicó la herencia en 8 años, a través de la expansión ferroviaria y una gestión implacable. Cuando William murió en 1885, dejó aproximadamente $200 millones divididos entre sus 8 hijos. George recibió directamente unos $10 millones, más una considerable renta fiduciaria. A los 23 años se hizo más rico de lo que podría gastar en varias vidas. George era diferente de sus parientes. Sus hermanos mayores construyeron mansiones en Manhattan y Newport, compitiendo por construir las piezas de exhibición más elaboradas. En la Quinta Avenida y a lo largo de la costa de Rhode Island, organizaban bailes de disfraces que costaban fortunas y llenaban los periódicos con relatos escandalosos de excesos. George prefería los libros a las fiestas, hablaba 8 idiomas, coleccionaba arte y viajó por Europa estudiando arquitectura y diseño paisajístico. Era tímido, intelectual e incómodo con las ostentaciones de riqueza performativas que definían la sociedad de la Edad Dorada. En 1888, George visitó Asheville, Carolina del Norte, por su salud. Los médicos le recomendaron el aire de la montaña para sus problemas respiratorios crónicos. La ciudad se asentaba en un valle rodeado por las montañas Blue Ridge, accesible por ferrocarril, pero aún relativamente aislada de las ciudades del este. El clima era templado, el paisaje espectacular, la tierra barata. George vio algo más allá de un retiro de salud. Los bosques le recordaban a las fincas europeas que había visitado. Las montañas proporcionaban límites naturales y privacidad. La región estaba económicamente deprimida, lo que significaba que la mano de obra y los materiales costarían mucho menos que en el norte industrializado. Podría construir algo aquí, que sería imposible en otro lugar. Comenzó a comprar tierras inmediatamente. Para 1889, había adquirido aproximadamente 125,000 acres alrededor de Asheville, un área más grande que muchas ciudades del este. El precio era notablemente bajo. Gran parte de la tierra había sido talada o cultivada hasta el agotamiento. Los propietarios locales, que luchaban económicamente después de la devastación del sur por la guerra civil, vendieron con avidez al rico norteño que ofrecía efectivo. George contrató a los mejores diseñadores que el dinero podía conseguir. Richard Morris Hunt era el arquitecto preeminente de América, formado en la École des Beaux-Arts de París. Hunt había diseñado el pedestal para la Estatua de la Libertad y numerosas mansiones en la Quinta Avenida para la familia Vanderbilt. Él entendía la gran escala y la proporción clásica. George le pidió que diseñara una casa digna del entorno montañoso. Frederick Law Olmsted recibió el encargo de paisajismo. Olmsted había diseñado Central Park en Manhattan y parques en docenas de ciudades americanas. Había sido pionero en la profesión de la arquitectura paisajística en los Estados Unidos. A sus 67 años, estaba en la cima de sus capacidades y reputación. George quería que Olmsted transformara 125,000 acres de bosque talado y tierras de cultivo agotadas en un paisaje planificado que rivalizaría con cualquier cosa en Europa. La concepción inicial era modesta en comparación con lo que finalmente surgió. George habló de construir una casa de campo donde pudiera retirarse de la sociedad. And pursue his intellectual interests, Hunt sketched a comfortable residence. Olmsted proposed gardens and a working farm. The project expanded rapidly. Hunt's sketches grew more elaborate with each revision. George wanted a library. To house his growing book collection, which already numbered in the thousands, he wanted guest rooms for extended visits from family and friends. He wanted entertainment spaces appropriate for occasional social obligations. He wanted technological systems that would make the house comfortable and modern. Hunt looked to the Loire Valley in France for inspiration, the château of the French Renaissance. Combined grandeur with livability, formality with elegance. He designed a 4-story limestone structure with a steeply pitched roof, massive chimneys, and elaborate stone carving. The style was French Renaissance revival. Transplanted to the American South, Olmsted conceived something unprecedented in America. Rather than simply landscaping around a house, he would create a managed landscape encompassing the entire property. Formal gardens would surround the residence. Beyond them, planned forest would demonstrate scientific forestry practices. A model farm would prove that modern agricultural methods could restore the region's depleted soil. The estate would be self-sufficient, producing its own food, lumber, and income. Construction began in 1889. A private railroad spur was built to the construction site to transport materials. Limestone was quarried in Indiana and shipped south. Craftsmen were recruited from across America and Europe. At peak activity, more than 1,000 workers labored on the house and ground simultaneously. The scale defied anything. Previously attempted by a private individual in America, the foundations required excavating into bedrock. The steel structural frame was engineered to support stone walls 4 feet thick. The roof covered more than an acre. Every system was designed for permanence, as though the house would stand for centuries. George visited the site regularly during construction, making decisions on details that ranged from stone selection to furniture placement. He worked directly with Hunt and Olmsted, refining plans as the structure rose. The project consumed his attention completely. He had no interest in business or politics. Building Biltmore became his life's work. The house was designed around specific functions. The ground floor contained public spaces, a banquet hall that could seat 64 guests, a library designed to hold 10,000 volumes, a billiard room, and multiple sitting rooms. The second floor held family bedrooms and guest suites. The third floor contained additional guest rooms and storage. The fourth floor housed servants' quarters. Below ground, a basement level contained kitchens, laundries, mechanical systems, and a swimming pool. Technology was integrated throughout. Electric lights, powered by the estate's own generator, illuminated every room. Central heating systems carried steam through miles of pipes. An intercom system allowed communication between floors. Elevators transported people and supplies. The house contained innovations that most American buildings would not adopt for decades. Olmsted's landscape work proceeded simultaneously. He planted hundreds of thousands of trees and shrubs, many imported from Europe and Asia. He created a 3-mile approach road that wound through planned forest designed to build anticipation before revealing the house. Formal gardens descended from terraces behind the residence, featuring fountains, statuary, and seasonal plantings. The farm encompassed thousands of acres with dairy operations, vegetable gardens, and livestock. By 1895, construction was sufficiently complete for occupancy. George opened the house on Christmas Eve with a family celebration. The project had consumed 6 years and approximately $6 million, equivalent to more than $200 million in current dollars. The result was unlike anything else in America. Biltmore contained 250 rooms, spread across approximately 175,000 square feet of finished floor space. It had 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces. The banquet hall rose 75 feet to a barrel-vaulted ceiling. The library's shelves stretched 2 stories high. The indoor swimming pool measured 70 feet long, lined with imported tile. The house was simultaneously a residence, a museum, and a statement about what private wealth could accomplish. George was 33 years old when he moved in. Había creado la residencia privada más grande de la historia de Estados Unidos. Había empleado a miles de trabajadores durante años. Había demostrado que un hombre rico podía construir algo que rivalizara con los palacios europeos. También había construido algo que ya estaba obsoleto. El mundo que hizo posible Biltmore estaba a punto de cambiar por completo. En la Nochebuena de 1895, George Vanderbilt abrió la casa Biltmore a su familia por primera vez. La nieve cubría las montañas Blue Ridge. El camino de acceso serpenteaba a través de 3 millas de bosque planificado, antes de revelar el castillo que se alzaba desde su ladera aterrazada. En el interior, luces eléctricas iluminaban habitaciones llenas de arte y muebles, coleccionados por toda Europa. Un fuego ardía en el salón de banquetes bajo un techo abovedado de cañón de 75 pies. La casa estaba finalmente lista. Los números definían lo que George había construido. Biltmore contenía 250 habitaciones distribuidas en 4 pisos, más un sótano completo. Había 35 dormitorios para la familia e invitados. 43 baños contaban con fontanería moderna con agua corriente fría y caliente. 65 chimeneas proporcionaban calefacción suplementaria en toda la estructura. El espacio habitable terminado medía aproximadamente 175,000 pies cuadrados, aproximadamente 4 acres bajo un mismo techo. Richard Morris Hunt había diseñado el exterior al estilo de los castillos del Valle del Loira. La piedra caliza de Indiana formaba las paredes, de 4 pies de espesor en los cimientos. El tejado de fuerte pendiente cubierto de pizarra se elevaba hacia elaboradas chimeneas y agujas decorativas. La talla de piedra cubría la fachada con detalles renacentistas que requerían artesanos formados en técnicas tradicionales europeas. El efecto a distancia sugería un palacio francés transportado a las montañas americanas. Los espacios interiores reflejaban la intención de George de crear no solo una residencia, sino un museo privado. El vestíbulo de entrada se elevaba a 3 pisos, iluminado por una enorme araña de hierro forjado. El salón de banquetes podía albergar a 64 invitados en una sola mesa bajo un techo pintado con diseños medievales. La biblioteca ocupaba 2 pisos con estanterías diseñadas para albergar 10,000 volúmenes. La colección de George ya sumaba más de 20,000 libros en 8 idiomas. El jardín de invierno traía el exterior al interior. Un invernadero con techo de cristal presentaba una fuente central rodeada de plantas tropicales, que florecerían todo el año. Palmeras se extendían hacia tragaluces 3 pisos más arriba. El espacio demostró que la tecnología podía superar los fenómenos climáticos, proporcionando un verano permanente dentro de la montaña. Las instalaciones de recreo invernal reflejaban el exceso de la Edad Dorada, adaptado para uso privado. La bolera en el sótano contaba con equipos importados de fabricantes europeos. Una piscina cubierta medía 70 pies de largo, revestida con azulejos traídos de fabricantes especializados en baños turcos. Un gimnasio contenía equipos para la cultura física moderna. Estos eran lujos que solo los hoteles más ricos ofrecían al público. George los instaló para su uso personal. Los sistemas tecnológicos integrados en todo Biltmore representaban la vanguardia de la ingeniería de la década de 1890. Iluminación eléctrica, alimentada por la propia planta generadora de la finca, eliminaba la necesidad de lámparas de gas o aceite. La calefacción central distribuía vapor a través de millas de tuberías de cobre a radiadores en cada habitación principal. Un sistema de intercomunicación eléctrico conectaba habitaciones en toda la vasta casa, permitiendo a los sirvientes recibir instrucciones sin recorrer los pasillos. 2 ascensores transportaban pasajeros y carga entre pisos. Sistemas de refrigeración enfriaban habitaciones, designadas para el almacenamiento de alimentos. Estas eran innovaciones que la mayoría de los edificios americanos no adoptarían hasta otra generación. El personal necesario para operar Biltmore sumaba más de 80 personas que vivían en la finca. 30 sirvientes trabajaban dentro de la casa como cocineros, doncellas, mayordomos y lacayos. Trabajadores adicionales mantenían los sistemas mecánicos, cuidaban los jardines y operaban la granja. El 4º piso de la casa estaba dedicado enteramente a los cuartos de servicio, con pequeños dormitorios, comedores separados y una red de escaleras traseras y pasajes de servicio que permitía al personal moverse por el edificio sin molestar a la familia. El trabajo paisajístico de Frederick Law Olmsted se extendía por toda la propiedad de 125,000 acres. Inmediatamente alrededor de la casa, jardines formales descendían en una serie de terrazas. El jardín italiano presentaba un estanque reflectante y estatuas clásicas. El jardín amurallado encerraba 3 acres de plantas con flores. Arranged in geometric beds, the shrub garden collected specimens from across the world. In a naturalistic setting, the ramble offered walking paths through carefully planned woodland scenery. Beyond the formal gardens, Olmsted created what he called a managed forest. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to implement scientific forestry practices. On thousands of acres, the goal was to prove that American forests could be harvested sustainably while remaining profitable. The Biltmore Forestry Program became a model for conservation efforts nationwide and trained a generation of professional foresters. The farm operations occupied thousands of additional acres. A dairy herd produced milk, butter, and cheese. Vegetable gardens supplied the house kitchen. Livestock provided meat. Orchards yielded fruit. The estate was designed to be self-sufficient, producing everything needed for daily operations, while also generating income from surplus production sold to the local market. The financial reality was less sustainable than George hoped. Annual operating costs for the house and grounds exceeded $250,000, equivalent to millions in current dollars. George's income from his inheritance and trust funds was substantial, but not unlimited. The estate consumed wealth faster than his investments generated it. Within a few years of completion, George began seeking ways to reduce expenses. He married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, 3 years after opening the house. Their daughter Cornelia was born in 19. The only child, George, would have the house that could accommodate dozens of guests and required a staff of 80. Was occupied by a family of 3. George tried various schemes to make the estate financially viable. He opened a commercial dairy to sell Biltmore products to a wider market. He sold timber from the managed forests. He experimented with different agricultural approaches on the farmland. None generated sufficient revenue to offset the crushing operating costs. The house itself was simply too large and too expensive to maintain, even for a Vanderbilt. The problem was structural, not personal. Biltmore represented the absolute peak of what private wealth could build in America at the end of the 19th century. But the economic conditions that made such construction possible were already changing. George had built his château during a brief window when vast inherited fortunes faced almost no taxation. Labor was cheap and abundant, and society accepted extreme displays of wealth as natural consequences of industrial success. That window was closing. The Panic of 1893 had shaken public confidence in unregulated capitalism. Labor unions were organizing against the industrialists, whose fortunes funded estates like Biltmore. Progressive politicians were beginning to question whether such concentrated wealth served any public good. The pressure was building towards systematic change. George died unexpectedly in 1914 at age 51. Following complications from an appendectomy, his widow Edith inherited the estate and immediately confronted the financial crisis that George had been delaying. The house was consuming her resources. Property taxes were increasing as local governments sought revenue. The national mood was turning against ostentatious displays of inherited wealth. Edith made a decision that would save Biltmore but transform it completely. In 1930, she opened the house and gardens to paying tourists. Admission fees would help cover operating costs. The private residence became a public attraction. The family continued living in a small section of the house. But most rooms were now displayed for visitors who paid to see how the ultra-wealthy had lived a generation earlier. The transformation revealed something fundamental about Gilded Age mansions. They could not survive as residences. The economic model that built them had collapsed. The only way to preserve them was to convert them into museums, monuments to an era that had ended almost as soon as it began. Other Vanderbilt properties faced similar choices. The Breakers in Newport, Marble House, and dozens of other family estates would eventually open to the public or be demolished. The generation that built these houses intended them as dynasty headquarters that would shelter their descendants for centuries. Instead, they became tourist attractions within decades. Biltmore stood at the peak of American mansion building. It was the largest, the most expensive, and the last of its kind. Nothing comparable would ever be built again. No, porque los estadounidenses perdieran su ambición o su riqueza, sino porque las reglas cambiaron. Las fuerzas que harían imposible repetir lo construido ya estaban cobrando fuerza en 1895. En 20 años, alterarían fundamentalmente cómo podían vivir los estadounidenses ricos. En 1913, el mismo año en que murió George Vanderbilt, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos alteró fundamentalmente las reglas de la riqueza estadounidense. El 3 de febrero, los estados completaron la ratificación de la 16ª enmienda a la Constitución. El Congreso ahora poseía autoridad permanente para gravar los ingresos, cualquiera que fuera su fuente. La era de las fortunas no gravadas había terminado antes de 1913. El gobierno federal había impuesto un impuesto sobre la renta solo brevemente durante la Guerra Civil. Esa medida temporal expiró en 1872. La Corte Suprema anuló un intento posterior en 1895, dictaminando que la tributación directa sin reparto entre los estados violaba la Constitución. Durante la mayor parte de la Edad Dorada, los estadounidenses ricos no enfrentaron ningún impuesto federal sobre la renta. Podían acumular y gastar sus fortunas sin interferencia gubernamental, más allá de modestos aranceles e impuestos especiales. La 16ª enmienda lo cambió todo. El Congreso aprobó la primera ley permanente de impuestos sobre la renta en octubre de 1913. Las tasas iniciales parecían modestas. Los ingresos inferiores a $3,000 no pagaban ningún impuesto. Los ingresos entre $3,000 y $20,000 se gravaban al 1%. La tasa marginal máxima del 7% se aplicaba solo a ingresos que superaban los $500,000 anuales, lo que afectaba quizás a unos pocos cientos de familias en todo el país. Las tasas no se mantuvieron modestas. La Primera Guerra Mundial exigió ingresos gubernamentales sin precedentes. El Congreso elevó la tasa marginal máxima al 15% en 1916, luego al 67% en 1917 y finalmente al 77% en 1918. El umbral para la tasa máxima bajó a 1 millón, abarcando a un mayor número de individuos ricos. Un hombre que ganó 2 millones en 1918 entregaría más de 1.5 millones a la tributación federal. La guerra terminó, pero las altas tasas se mantuvieron en gran medida. El Congreso redujo la tasa máxima al 73% en 1921, luego al 58% en 1922 y finalmente al 25% en 1925. Durante unos años, pareció que la tributación podría volver a algo parecido a la norma de antes de la guerra. Las familias ricas reanudaron la construcción, el gasto y la exhibición de sus fortunas como lo habían hecho antes. La Gran Depresión destruyó esa esperanza permanentemente. El mercado de valores colapsó en octubre de 1929. Los bancos quebraron por miles. El desempleo alcanzó el 25% a nivel nacional y superó el 30% en ciudades industriales. La economía estadounidense se contrajo aproximadamente 1/3 en 4 años. La furia pública contra los ricos se intensificó, a medida que las colas para el pan se alargaban y los barrios de chabolas se extendían. El presidente Herbert Hoover, él mismo un hombre rico que había hecho su fortuna en la minería, propuso aumentar los impuestos a los ricos para abordar el déficit y financiar programas de ayuda. El Congreso aprobó la Ley de Ingresos de 1932, que aumentó la tasa marginal máxima al 63%. Cuando Franklin Roosevelt ganó la presidencia por abrumadora mayoría ese noviembre, hizo de los impuestos más altos a los ricos un pilar central de su agenda del New Deal. La Ley de Ingresos de 1935 elevó la tasa máxima al 79%, sobre ingresos que superaban los 5 millones anuales. Roosevelt lo llamó el impuesto a la riqueza y lo defendió explícitamente como un ataque a las fortunas concentradas. Argumentó que la desigualdad extrema amenazaba la democracia misma y que la tributación progresiva redistribuiría la riqueza de manera más justa en toda la sociedad. La Corte Suprema confirmó las nuevas tasas impositivas, abandonando su hostilidad anterior a la tributación sobre la renta. Para 1940, la tasa marginal máxima había alcanzado el 81%. Durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial, subió al 94% sobre ingresos superiores a $200,000. Durante las siguientes 3 décadas, la tasa máxima nunca bajó del 70%. Un estadounidense rico que ganaba 1 millón anualmente podría quedarse con menos de $100,000 después de los impuestos federales. El impuesto sobre la renta. Y en Múnich, era solo una parte de la presión sobre la economía de las mansiones. Los impuestos sobre el patrimonio se aplicaban cuando la riqueza se transfería entre generaciones. El Congreso impuso por primera vez un impuesto federal sobre el patrimonio en 1916, con una tasa máxima del 10% sobre patrimonios que superaban los 5 millones. La tasa subió constantemente, alcanzando el 25% en 1924, el 45% en 1934 y el 77% en 1941. La combinación fue devastadora para las familias que intentaban mantener grandes patrimonios a lo largo de generaciones, una fortuna que sobrevivía a la tributación sobre la renta. Mientras el constructor original vivía, enfrentaba impuestos sobre el patrimonio cuando moría. Si su heredero intentaba mantener la mansión familiar, los impuestos anuales sobre la propiedad consumían riqueza adicional. El sistema tributario de tres patas aseguró que incluso las fortunas más grandes eventualmente se dispersarían o agotarían. Los impuestos sobre la propiedad aumentaron simultáneamente a nivel estatal y local. Los gobiernos estatales y los municipios, desesperados por ingresos durante la depresión, aumentaron los valores de tasación y las tasas de molino. Una mansión que podría haber enfrentado impuestos a la propiedad de unos pocos miles de dólares anualmente en 1913, podría enfrentar facturas que excedían los $50,000 para la década de 1930. El costo continuo de poseer un palacio se volvió prohibitivo, independientemente de los ingresos. Las matemáticas eran simples y brutales. Considere una mansión que requería $250,000 anualmente para operar, similar a los costos de Biltmore en 1913. Un hombre con $500,000 de ingresos anuales no enfrentaba impuestos federales sobre la renta y podía cubrir fácilmente esos gastos para 1935. Ese mismo ingreso enfrentaba impuestos federales que se acercaban a los $400,000. Los 100,000 restantes no podían mantener la propiedad, pagar impuestos a la propiedad y mantener a la familia. Algunos intentaron reestructurar sus posesiones. Para minimizar la tributación, los fideicomisos y fundaciones ofrecieron protección limitada. Dividir los activos entre los miembros de la familia repartió la carga. Las donaciones caritativas estratégicas redujeron las propiedades gravables, pero estas medidas solo podían retrasar lo inevitable para las propiedades, que requerían cientos de miles de dólares en mantenimiento anual. Los sirvientes que mantenían estas casas también estaban desapareciendo, la industria del servicio doméstico que había empleado a millones de estadounidenses. Antes de la Primera Guerra Mundial, se contrajo drásticamente durante la década de 1920 y colapsó durante la Depresión. Los trabajos industriales pagaban mejor que el servicio doméstico. Las actitudes sociales cambiaron en contra de la servidumbre como carrera, incluso las familias adineradas que podían permitirse grandes dotaciones de personal encontraron cada vez más difícil contratar trabajadores calificados. Las leyes laborales añadieron presión. La Ley de Normas Justas de Trabajo de 1938 estableció salarios mínimos y horas máximas para la mayoría de los trabajadores. Las leyes estatales exigían seguros de compensación para trabajadores. La organización sindical llevó la negociación colectiva a las industrias que suministraban bienes y servicios. La mano de obra barata y abundante que había hecho económicamente viables las propiedades de la Edad Dorada estaba desapareciendo. La tecnología compensó parcialmente. Los electrodomésticos modernos redujeron el trabajo necesario para mantener una casa grande. Los sistemas de calefacción central reemplazaron los hornos de carbón que necesitaban atención constante. La refrigeración eléctrica eliminó la entrega de hielo. Las aspiradoras redujeron el personal necesario para la limpieza, pero ninguna tecnología podía eliminar el problema fundamental. Una casa de 250 habitaciones seguía siendo mucho más cara de operar que una casa de 20 habitaciones. Independientemente de las mejoras mecánicas, los ricos se adaptaron reduciendo la escala. Las nuevas construcciones en las décadas de 1920 y 1930 presentaban muchas menos habitaciones que las mansiones de la Edad Dorada. Las familias adineradas construyeron casas grandes y cómodas, pero no palacios. 20 o 30 habitaciones se convirtieron en el nuevo estándar para los muy ricos. 50 habitaciones marcaban una ambición excepcional. Nadie intentó igualar las 250 de Biltmore. Las mansiones existentes se convirtieron en pasivos, propiedades que habían sido activos en los balances. Se transformaron en una sangría para los recursos familiares. La tierra podría ser valiosa, Pero el edificio que se asentaba en esa tierra destruía activamente la riqueza a través de los costos operativos y la tributación. Las familias se enfrentaron a una elección: mantener la mansión y ver desaparecer la fortuna, o demoler la casa y liquidar el activo. La mayoría eligió la demolición. La desaparición de las mansiones comenzaría en serio en una década, pero las fuerzas económicas que lo hicieron inevitable ya estaban en marcha a mediados de la década de 1930. El impuesto sobre la renta, el impuesto sobre el patrimonio y el impuesto sobre la propiedad habían creado un entorno en el que construir o mantener una mega mansión era financieramente suicida. El gobierno no había ilegalizado tales casas, simplemente las había hecho imposibles de mantener. El Código Tributario había resuelto un problema político: la desigualdad extrema de la riqueza, que había amenazado la estabilidad social durante la Edad Dorada, estaba siendo sistemáticamente reducida a través de la tributación progresiva. Las fortunas aún podían construirse, pero no podían preservarse intactas a través de las generaciones. Mientras se mantenían ostentosas muestras de consumo, la sociedad había decidido, a través de sus representantes electos, que la concentración de riqueza a niveles de Vanderbilt era inaceptable. La pregunta que quedaba era práctica, más que política. Los multimillonarios que sobrevivieron a esta transformación no se empobrecieron. Siguieron siendo extraordinariamente ricos, en cualquier medida. Simplemente, ya no podían permitirse vivir en casas de 250 habitaciones. ¿Qué harían en su lugar? La respuesta remodelaría por completo la cultura de élite estadounidense. La demolición comenzó en la Quinta Avenida en 1926, la mansión que Cornelius Vanderbilt, el segundo, había construido en la esquina de la Quinta Avenida y la calle 57, fue derribada, completada en 1883. La casa había ocupado una manzana entera de la ciudad, contaba con 130 habitaciones, un salón de baile que podía albergar a 1,200 invitados. And interiors designed by the finest craftsmen in America, the family had lived there for 43 years. Demolition took less than 6 months. The site became commercial property. A bank and office building replaced the mansion. Generating rental income that dwarfed what the residents had cost to maintain, the Vanderbilts had made the economically rational choice. The house was consuming wealth. The land beneath it was valuable. Demolition solved both problems simultaneously. The pattern repeated across Manhattan. William Kissam Vanderbilt's mansion at 1660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1883 at a cost equivalent to tens of millions in current dollars, was demolished in 1927. The house had been the first in New York designed in the French château style, setting a trend that dominated elite architecture for a generation. 44 years after construction, it became rubble. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's mansion at Fifth Avenue and 65th Street disappeared in 1926. Mrs. Astor had been the queen of New York society, and her annual ball defined who belonged to the city's elite. Her ballroom could hold exactly 400 guests, giving rise to the phrase "the 400" as shorthand for high society. The mansion that hosted this social power was raised to make room for a luxury apartment building. The statistics tell the story. More than 100 major Gilded Age mansions lined Fifth Avenue between 42nd Street and 96th Street. These were not simply large houses, they were palaces, each requiring staffs of 20 to 50 servants each, representing millions of dollars in construction costs and hundreds of thousands in annual upkeep. By 1950, fewer than 10 survived. The rest had been demolished and replaced with apartment buildings, hotels, and commercial structures. The wave of destruction spread beyond Manhattan. Newport, Rhode Island, had been the summer capital of Gilded Age society. Families built cottages along the Atlantic coast that rivaled European palaces in scale and cost. These were vacation homes, occupied for perhaps 8 weeks each summer, staffed year-round to maintain them in readiness. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1895 at a cost of $7 million, survived only because the family donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County. In 1948, the alternative was demolition. No family member could afford to maintain a 70-room summer house that required 40 servants to operate. Donating it as a museum provided a tax deduction while ensuring its preservation. The house opened to tourists in 1948, and admission fees now fund its maintenance. Marble House, built by William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1892, followed the same path. The family gave it to the Preservation Society in 1963. Rosecliff, Château-sur-Mer. and other Newport mansions survived through similar arrangements. The houses that could not attract donors or preservation societies disappeared. Chicago lost virtually its entire collection of Gilded Age mansions. Potter Palmer's castle on Lakeshore Drive, completed in 1885, was demolished in 1950. The house had contained 42 rooms and a 3-story art gallery. Palmer had been one of Chicago's wealthiest merchants, and his mansion had defined elite architecture in the city. For decades, the land was worth more empty than occupied. The same pattern played out in San Francisco, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and every major American city. Houses built to last centuries were demolished within 2 or 3 generations. The economics were inescapable. Annual operating costs exceeded what even wealthy families could justify spending. Property taxes consumed additional resources. The land itself was worth more for higher density uses. What replaces these mansions reveals the transformation clearly. Apartment buildings generated rental income from dozens or hundreds of units on the same land that had held one family. Office buildings created even higher returns. Commercial hotels put property to profit-generating use. The American real estate market had become too sophisticated and too expensive to tolerate single-family mansions on premium urban land. The few mansions that survived did so by transforming their function entirely. The Frick Collection in Manhattan occupies the former residence of industrialist Henry Clay Frick, completed in 1914. The house was designed from the beginning. With eventual museum use in mind, Frick's will provided an endowment to maintain it as a public art gallery. After his death, the house opened as a museum in 1935 and remains one of New York's premier cultural institutions. El Museo de Diseño Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian ocupa la mansión de Andrew Carnegie en la Quinta Avenida y la calle 91. Construida en 1902, la casa de 64 habitaciones era la mansión más al norte de la Quinta Avenida cuando se construyó. Carnegie eligió la ubicación específicamente porque el terreno era más barato que más al sur del centro. La familia la donó al Smithsonian en 1972 para su conversión en museo. Se conservó porque se convirtió en algo más que una residencia. La Biblioteca Morgan conserva el edificio de la biblioteca de J.P. Morgan, adyacente a su mansión demolida. Morgan construyó la biblioteca en 1906 para albergar su colección de libros raros y manuscritos. La casa ya no existe, pero la biblioteca sobrevive. Como museo y centro de investigación, el patrón se mantiene. El uso institucional justificó la preservación, el uso residencial garantizó la demolición. Incluso Biltmore, la más grande y famosa de todas las mansiones americanas, sobrevivió solo abriendo sus puertas a los turistas en 1930. La familia Vanderbilt mantuvo la propiedad, pero ya no podía permitirse vivir en toda la casa. Las tarifas de entrada de los visitantes cubrían los costos operativos que ninguna familia podía sostener de forma privada. La casa se convirtió en un museo que casualmente tenía miembros de la familia, todavía viviendo en un ala. La crisis del personal aceleró la ola de demoliciones. El servicio doméstico había empleado a millones de estadounidenses antes de la Primera Guerra Mundial. Para la década de 1930, la industria se había derrumbado. Los jóvenes elegían trabajos en fábricas o trabajo de oficina en lugar del servicio doméstico. Incluso las familias con suficiente riqueza para mantener casas grandes no podían encontrar trabajadores dispuestos a ocupar los puestos. La tecnología ayudó, pero no pudo compensar por completo. Los electrodomésticos modernos redujeron el trabajo requerido para la limpieza. Cocina y mantenimiento. Los sistemas centrales de calefacción y refrigeración eliminaron algunas de las tareas más intensivas en mano de obra, pero ningún avance tecnológico podría hacer que una casa de 100 habitaciones fuera tan eficiente de operar como una de 20 habitaciones. La escala en sí misma era el problema. La Gran Depresión dio el empujón final. Las familias que luchaban por mantener casas enormes mientras sus ingresos por inversiones desaparecían se enfrentaron a decisiones difíciles. Algunas aguantaron durante la década de 1930, consumiendo capital para cubrir pérdidas operativas. La mayoría concluyó que preservar la fortuna familiar importaba más que preservar la mansión familiar. Las casas fueron demolidas. Para 1950, la transformación estaba completa. La mansión americana, como símbolo de la Edad Dorada, se había extinguido. Las que sobrevivieron lo hicieron como museos, escuelas o edificios institucionales. Ninguna funcionaba como residencia privada de la manera en que sus constructores habían previsto. La era de construir palacios para uno mismo había terminado permanentemente. Los ricos no desaparecieron. Simplemente aprendieron a vivir de manera diferente. Los multimillonarios que quedaron después de la desaparición de las mansiones controlaban fortunas que habrían asombrado a los Vanderbilt. Se habían adaptado a un mundo donde las exhibiciones visibles de riqueza invitaban a la tributación, la regulación y la furia pública. La pregunta no era si seguirían gastando pródigamente. La pregunta era, ¿a dónde iría su dinero si no a casas de 250 habitaciones? El multimillonario moderno. Posee más de lo que George Vanderbilt jamás imaginó. Simplemente no puedes verlo. Bill Gates vive en una casa llamada Xanadu 2.0 a orillas del lago Washington, cerca de Seattle. La residencia mide aproximadamente 66,000 pies cuadrados. Distribuidos en varios edificios en 5 acres. Esto es grande para cualquier estándar. Podría albergar quizás 40 habitaciones si se dividiera convencionalmente, pero no es un palacio, no está destinada a ser vista desde la calle o a inspirar asombro en los visitantes. El enfoque es deliberadamente discreto. Los árboles ocultan la propiedad de la vista pública. El diseño prioriza la tecnología y la privacidad sobre la grandeza y la ostentación. La casa costó un estimado de $63 millones construirla. En la década de 1990, una suma considerable, pero una fracción de lo que Gates podía permitirse. Su patrimonio neto ha superado los $100,000 millones en varios momentos. Podría haber construido 10 Biltmores. Eligió no hacerlo. La decisión fue estratégica, no modesta. Jeff Bezos sigue un patrón similar. Sus propiedades inmobiliarias abarcan múltiples propiedades valoradas en cientos de millones colectivamente. Una mansión en Beverly Hills, apartamentos en Nueva York, un rancho en Texas, un complejo en Washington. Cada propiedad es sustancial, pero ninguna se acerca a la escala de un palacio. Bezos posee más superficie residencial total que los Vanderbilt, pero la ha distribuido en diferentes ubicaciones y la ha ocultado detrás de estructuras corporativas. El público rara vez ve algo de ello. Mark Zuckerberg compró su casa en Palo Alto en 2011 por $7 millones. La casa en sí es relativamente modesta para un multimillonario, aproximadamente 5,000 pies cuadrados, pero Zuckerberg luego compró las 4 propiedades circundantes. Over the following years, for a combined $43 million, the strategy was not expansion but privacy. By controlling the neighboring land, he created a buffer zone that prevents close observation of his residence. The investment was defensive, not ostentatious. This pattern reflects a deliberate shift in how the ultra-wealthy approach residential real estate. The calculation has changed completely since the Gilded Age. Building a visible palace creates multiple problems that Gates, Bezos, and Zuckerberg understand instinctively. First, security. Ostentatious display attracts unwanted attention, kidnapping. Became a serious concern for wealthy families after the Lindbergh baby abduction in 1932. Subsequent decades brought additional threats from political radicals, opportunistic criminals, and mentally unstable individuals fixated on the rich. A visible mansion advertises the location of vulnerable family members. Modern billionaires prefer anonymity. Second, taxation. Property assessors notice palaces. A 250-room mansion generates an enormous property tax bill annually. Assessment fights with local governments consume time and money. Smaller properties in favorable jurisdictions minimize this burden. Many billionaires maintain legal residences in states with no income tax and low property taxes. Florida, Texas. Nevada and Wyoming attract wealthy residents for precisely this reason. Third, public relations. Building a palace invites media coverage and public criticism. The Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 demonstrated continuing public hostility toward visible wealth inequality. Politicians seeking populist support target billionaire excess regularly. Conspicuous consumption creates political liabilities that billionaires prefer to avoid. This strategic response has been to shift wealth away from residential real estate entirely, rather than investing hundreds of millions in a single showpiece mansion. Modern billionaires deploy capital across diverse holdings that generate returns rather than consuming resources. The compound strategy exemplifies this approach. Rather than building one enormous house, wealthy individuals construct multiple smaller structures on large properties. Each building serves a specific function. One contains living quarters. Another houses offices. A third provides guest accommodations. A fourth holds recreational facilities. The total square footage may equal or exceed Gilded Age mansions, but the architectural presentation remains deliberately. Modest Silicon Valley billionaires particularly favor this approach. Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, owns approximately 1,500 acres on the Hawaiian island of Lanai, which he purchased outright for $300 million in 2012. He controls an entire island, something no Vanderbilt achieved, but the individual structures on the property remain relatively small and widely distributed. The power lies in owning the island, not in building a palace visible from the sea. Ownership structure matters as much as physical structure. Modern billionaires typically hold property through limited liability companies, trusts, and other legal entities that obscure personal connection. Public records may show that 123 Property Holdings LLC owns a particular estate, but connecting that entity to a specific billionaire requires substantial research. The privacy protection is deliberate and professionally maintained. This opacity serves multiple purposes. It complicates security threats by making it harder to locate family members. It reduces property tax assessments by eliminating the premium that attaches to celebrity ownership. It shields wealth from public scrutiny that might generate political pressure for higher taxation. The strategy treats residential real estate as a security liability to be minimized rather than a status symbol to be displayed. The tax advantages extend beyond annual property taxes. Estate planning drives many residential real estate decisions. A $100 million mansion represents $100 million subject to estate tax when the owner dies. That same $100 million invested in productive assets generates income while growing in value, and sophisticated estate planning can shield much of it from taxation. The mansion consumes wealth. The investment portfolio multiplies. Its conservation easements provide additional benefits. Wealthy landowners who donate development rights on large properties receive substantial tax deductions while retaining use of the land. Ted Turner ha utilizado esta estrategia ampliamente en sus numerosos ranchos por todo el oeste americano. La tierra permanece bajo su control, pero obtiene beneficios fiscales al restringir el desarrollo futuro. El cálculo es sencillo. Un multimillonario con $10,000 millones en activos que construye un palacio de $500 millones destruye riqueza de múltiples maneras. La construcción consume capital. Los costos operativos anuales consumen capital adicional. Los impuestos a la propiedad consumen más. El activo se aprecia lentamente, si es que lo hace, mientras requiere un mantenimiento constante. Cuando el propietario muere, los impuestos de sucesión reclaman una porción significativa. El palacio es una máquina de destrucción de riqueza. Esos mismos $500 millones, invertidos en una cartera diversificada de acciones, bonos y capital privado, generan rendimientos anuales sustanciales. Los activos crecen con el tiempo. La gestión profesional minimiza la obligación fiscal y las estructuras de planificación patrimonial protegen la riqueza para las generaciones futuras. La cartera es una máquina de multiplicación de riqueza. Los multimillonarios modernos entienden este cálculo perfectamente. Mantienen residencias cómodas, a menudo bastante grandes para los estándares normales, pero evitan la escala, que definía las mansiones de la Edad Dorada. La riqueza existe, pero fluye hacia canales que generan rendimientos en lugar de consumir recursos. ¿A dónde va esa riqueza si no es a palacios? La respuesta revela algo más preocupante que la ostentación de la Edad Dorada. John D. Rockefeller construyó Kikwit, su propiedad con vistas al río Hudson. Su fundación construyó la sede de las Naciones Unidas. La mansión costó millones. La fundación controla miles de millones, lo que representa más poder. El modelo Rockefeller estableció el patrón que siguen los multimillonarios modernos: transformarse de monopolista odiado a filántropo celebrado a través de donaciones caritativas estratégicas. La estrategia cumple múltiples propósitos simultáneamente, proporciona enormes deducciones fiscales, moldea la política pública sin supervisión democrática y compra reputación y legado. Lo más importante es que permite que la riqueza ejerza poder a través de generaciones de maneras que las mansiones nunca podrían. La Fundación Benéfica Moderna opera como algo entre una organización sin fines de lucro y un fideicomiso dinástico. Los activos colocados en la fundación evitan por completo los impuestos de sucesión. La fundación misma no paga impuestos sobre los ingresos de inversión. Las subvenciones a organizaciones benéficas calificadas proporcionan un beneficio público, mientras promueven las prioridades del fundador. Los miembros de la familia a menudo sirven como fideicomisarios, controlando miles de millones a perpetuidad. La escala empequeñece cualquier cosa que la Edad Dorada hubiera imaginado. La Fundación Bill y Melinda Gates posee una dotación que supera los $50,000 millones, lo que la convierte en la fundación benéfica privada más grande del mundo. La concesión anual de subvenciones supera los $5,000 millones. La fundación moldea la política de salud global, la reforma educativa y el desarrollo agrícola en docenas de países. Su influencia solo en los programas internacionales de vacunación afecta a cientos de millones de personas. El modelo de fundación proporciona algo que una mansión no puede. Un palacio exhibe riqueza, pero no ejerce poder directo más allá de impresionar a los visitantes. Una fundación, con una dotación de $50,000 millones, moldea las prioridades de gobiernos, universidades y organizaciones internacionales. Las decisiones de financiación de la Fundación Gates influyen en las agendas de investigación, las estrategias de salud pública y las políticas educativas a nivel mundial. Este es un poder que persiste independientemente de dónde elija dormir Bill Gates por la noche. La iniciativa Chan Zuckerberg, establecida en 2015, lleva el modelo más allá. En lugar de crear una fundación benéfica tradicional, Mark Zuckerberg y su esposa Priscilla Chan estructuraron su filantropía como una sociedad de responsabilidad limitada. Esto proporciona una flexibilidad aún mayor. Una LLC puede hacer donaciones políticas, invertir en empresas con fines de lucro y cabildear por cambios de políticas que las fundaciones tradicionales no pueden perseguir. Zuckerberg se comprometió a transferir el 99% de sus acciones de Facebook a la iniciativa. Un compromiso valorado en más de $100,000 millones en varias valoraciones de mercado. La estructura de LLC atrajo críticas precisamente porque evita las restricciones que se aplican a las fundaciones benéficas. Las fundaciones tradicionales deben distribuir al menos el 5% de sus activos anualmente a organizaciones benéficas calificadas, se enfrentan a límites estrictos en la actividad política, deben divulgar sus finanzas públicamente. La iniciativa Chan Zuckerberg no enfrenta ninguno de estos requisitos. It operates as a private investment vehicle that can pursue any goal the founders choose, charitable or otherwise, while benefiting from the tax deductions associated with charitable giving. Jeff Bezos announced the Bezos Earth Fund in 2020, committing $10 billion to fight climate change. The sum represents approximately 8% of his net worth at the time. A substantial commitment, but hardly a sacrifice. The fund provides Bezos with significant influence over climate policy and environmental organizations worldwide. More importantly, it provides favorable publicity at a time when Amazon faces increasing criticism for its environmental impact and labor practices. The tax implications are substantial. A billionaire who donates $10 billion to a charitable foundation receives a tax deduction for the full amount at the highest tax rates. This could save approximately $4 billion in federal taxes, the remaining $6 billion, which the billionaire genuinely surrendered. Purchases enormous influence over how and where those funds are deployed. The foundation invests the endowment, generating returns that fund grants in perpetuity. The donor's priorities shape charitable giving long after their death. Media ownership provides another channel for influence that mansions could never deliver. Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post in 2013 for $250 million. This was pocket change for a man worth more than $100 billion at the time, but the acquisition provided ownership of one of America's most influential newspapers, a publication that shapes political discourse in the nation's capital. The Post operates independently under Bezos' ownership, maintaining journalistic standards that predate his acquisition. But the mere fact of his ownership raises inevitable questions about coverage of Amazon, his space company Blue Origin, and his personal affairs. Publishers traditionally wielded enormous political influence. Bezos acquired that influence for less than the cost of maintaining Biltmore for 2 years. Lorraine Powell Jobs, widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs, purchased a majority stake in The Atlantic magazine in 2017. Mark Benioff, founder of Salesforce, bought Time magazine in 2018 for $190 million. Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the Los Angeles Times in 2018 for $500 million in each case. Billionaires acquired major media properties for sums that represented tiny fractions of their total wealth. The pattern reflects a calculated strategy. Major media properties confer prestige and influence disproportionate to their financial value. Most operate at losses or narrow margins, making them unattractive to profit-focused investors, but for billionaires seeking platforms to shape public discourse. These properties are bargains. The cost of ownership is trivial. The potential influence is substantial. Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter in 2022 for approximately $44 billion represents the extreme version of this strategy. The platform had roughly 400 million users and served as a primary channel for political discourse, news dissemination, and public debate. Musk's purchase gave him control over the algorithms that determine what hundreds of millions of people see, the moderation policies that govern what they can say, and the features that shape how they interact. The price was substantial, even for Musk, requiring him to leverage other assets and take on significant debt, but the acquisition provided something no mansion could offer. Twitter is infrastructure. It is a platform that politicians, journalists, activists, and citizens worldwide depend on for communication. Controlling that platform provides influence over public discourse itself. The comparison to Gilded Age power is instructive. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining. This gave him enormous economic power and substantial political influence. But his power operated through market mechanisms and was ultimately constrained by antitrust law. Modern platform owners exercise power more directly. They control the systems through which information flows, conversations occur, and communities form. Mark Zuckerberg controls Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp platforms with more than 3 billion combined users. This is a larger population than any nation-state. The algorithms that determine what content these users see, the policies that govern what they can post, and the data collection practices that monetize their attention are all controlled by Zuckerberg and his subordinates. No king, president, or prime minister exercises comparable power over so many people. Jeff Bezos built Amazon into a platform that controls approximately 40% of American e-commerce. Amazon Web Services provides the infrastructure that runs substantial portions of the internet. Bezos also owns the Washington Post and is building Blue Origin to commercialize space access, the integration of e-commerce platform, cloud computing infrastructure, media property, and aerospace company. Creates a vertically integrated empire that Standard Oil might envy. The political influence flows naturally from economic control. The largest corporations spend hundreds of millions annually on lobbying and campaign contributions. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010 removed many restrictions on corporate political spending, opening channels for wealth to influence elections directly. Billionaires can now fund political campaigns, lobbying efforts, and issue advocacy. At scales that would have been illegal in previous generations, the calculation is straightforward. Why build a palace that costs hundreds of millions, generates no income, and exercises no power beyond aesthetic display? When that same capital could fund a foundation that shapes global health policy, purchase a media property that influences public discourse, or acquire a platform that controls how billions of people communicate. The answer is obvious to every modern billionaire. The mansion is obsolete, not because wealth disappeared, but because better instruments of power emerged. The Vanderbilts built monuments to themselves that tourists now visit for admission fees. Modern billionaires build systems of control that most people do not even recognize as concentrated power. The wealth is greater, the influence is deeper, the visibility is far less. Yet for all this influence, attraversing the ultra-wealthy still needs somewhere to live. What they build now reveals the final transformation of American elite culture. Mark Zuckerberg's compound on the Hawaiian island of Kauai illustrates the modern approach. Beginning in 2014, Zuckerberg and his wife purchased approximately 1,500 acres of land on the island's north shore for more than $100 million. The property includes beaches, forests, and former plantation land. In 2016, Zuckerberg began constructing a 6-foot wall around portions of the property, triggering local controversy and accusations of colonialism. The wall was not decorative. It was functional, designed to prevent observation and access. The compound strategy reflects the fortress mentality that defines modern billionaire residential planning, rather than building a palace that welcomes admiration. Zuckerberg constructed a barrier that enforces exclusion. The contrast with Biltmore could not be more complete. George Vanderbilt built his mansion on a prominent hilltop and invited visitors to marvel at its scale. Zuckerberg hides behind walls on a remote island and resents anyone who notices. Larry Ellison took the fortress concept to its logical extreme in 2012. Ellison purchased approximately 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai for an estimated $300 million. The island spans roughly 140 square miles and had a population of about 3,000 residents. At the time of purchase, Ellison now controls nearly an entire island, something no American tycoon had achieved since the 19th century. Ellison has not built a single mega mansion on Lanai instead. He has developed multiple properties across the island, invested in luxury resorts, and implemented agricultural and conservation projects. The strategy treats the island itself as the estate rather than any individual structure. Geographic isolation provides security and privacy that walls alone cannot deliver. Owning the island means controlling who arrives and under what circumstances. The ranch estate represents another favored approach among the ultra-wealthy. Ted Turner owns approximately 2 million acres across multiple properties in Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico, and other western states. This makes him the second largest private landowner in America. John Malone owns approximately 2.2 million acres, making him the largest. Both men acquired their holdings gradually over decades, assembling enormous territories from smaller ranches and farms. These properties are not residential showpieces. They are working ranches that generate modest income from cattle, bison, and conservation activities. The residences on these properties remain relatively modest, often comprising multiple small structures rather than single palaces. The power lies in controlling vast territories, not in building impressive houses. A billionaire who owns 1 million acres controls more land than many European principalities, but does so without attracting the attention that a 250-room mansion would generate. The conservation framing provides additional benefits. Wealthy landowners who place conservation easements on their properties receive substantial tax deductions while retaining use of the land. The easements restrict future development, protecting the land in perpetuity. While providing immediate financial benefits to the owner, Turner has used this strategy extensively, protecting hundreds of thousands of acres while capturing tax benefits worth tens of millions. The doomsday bunker trend reveals something darker about modern billionaire psychology. Since 2008, survivalist preparation has become increasingly common among Silicon Valley elites. Peter Thiel purchased property in New Zealand and obtained citizenship there. Reportedly, as insurance against social collapse in the United States, other tech billionaires have followed similar strategies, acquiring remote properties as potential refuges. The bunker construction industry has grown to serve this demand. Companies now specialize in converting decommissioned missile silos into luxury underground residences. These facilities feature air filtration systems, independent power generation, extensive food storage, and security systems designed to withstand civil unrest or environmental catastrophe. Prices range from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of dollars, depending on specifications. The psychology behind bunker preparation differs fundamentally from Gilded Age mansion building. Vanderbilt built Biltmore to display confidence and permanence. He expected his fortune and his family to endure for generations on that mountain. Modern billionaires building bunkers expect society to collapse and plan accordingly. The shift from palace to fortress to bunker traces a progression from confidence to anxiety to paranoia. Urban anonymity provides yet another strategy. Ken Griffin, founder of hedge fund Citadel, has purchased multiple floors in Chicago's highest residential buildings. Rather than building a single mansion, the strategy provides luxury accommodation while avoiding the visibility of a standalone palace. High-rise living offers security advantages through controlled access, professional management, and the anonymity that comes from living among other wealthy residents rather than in an isolated estate. Griffin announced in 20 towns and twice in Syria. Known recently announced Australian 2021 that he would relocate Citadel's headquarters from Chicago to Miami, citing concerns about crime and Chicago's tax environment. Florida offers no state income tax, lower property taxes, and a political climate favorable to business interests. The move illustrates how modern billionaires prioritize tax efficiency over any particular location or architectural legacy. The corporate campus residence represents, perhaps, the most distinctive modern development. Major technology companies now provide housing for employees on or near company property, blurring the boundary between work and life. Google, Facebook, and Apple have all developed extensive campuses that include not just offices but also restaurants, fitness facilities, medical services, and in some cases, residential units for billionaire founders and executives. The campus becomes a kind of estate. Larry Page and Sergey Brin effectively live at Google, spending more waking hours on campus than anywhere else. Mark Zuckerberg's home in Palo Alto sits minutes from Facebook headquarters, and he reportedly works from home regularly, making the distinction between residence and office largely semantic. The campus provides everything a traditional estate offered: security services, community. Without the visibility and tax burden of a palace, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin facility in West Texas illustrates this model at its most extreme. The company's launch site and testing facility sprawls across hundreds of thousands of acres in a remote desert region. Bezos maintains residential facilities on the property, blending workspace with personal retreat. The facility is technically a commercial aerospace operation, but it also functions as a private domain where Bezos can pursue his space ambitions. Away from public scrutiny, common threads connect these diverse strategies. Every approach prioritizes privacy and security over display. Every approach seeks to minimize taxation through jurisdiction selection, legal structures, or conservation mechanisms. Every approach reflects awareness that visible wealth attracts negative attention from criminals, activists, politicians, and the public. Most importantly, none of these approaches creates anything. Like Biltmore, no modern billionaire builds a 250-room house meant to be admired by the public and preserved for generations. The ultra-wealthy still control enormous resources and occupy substantial properties, but they do so in ways designed to hide wealth rather than display it. The mansion as statement of permanence and confidence has been replaced by compounds, ranches, bunkers, and urban anonymity that reflect a different psychology entirely. The question is whether this transformation represents progress. Gilded Age mansions offended democratic sensibilities and wasted resources on ostentation, but at least everyone could see the wealth and knew who possessed it. Modern billionaire holdings are vast, powerful, and largely invisible. The public cannot photograph what it cannot find. The tax assessor cannot value what is hidden behind LLCs. The historian cannot study what leaves. No architectural record. Biltmore still stands because it became something George Vanderbilt never intended. The private retreat became a public museum. The family seat became a tourist attraction. The monument to one man's wealth became a source of employment and economic activity for an entire region. Whether any of today's billionaire compounds will serve similar purposes a century from now remains uncertain. Most were designed to disappear rather than endure. Block section 7, she word count approx 1,050 words. Today, Biltmore Estate receives approximately 1.4 million visitors annually. They arrive by car and tour bus, purchase admission tickets, and walk through rooms preserved exactly as they appeared when George Vanderbilt died. The banquet hall still displays the long table set for Christmas dinner. The library still holds thousands of books on shelves. Rising 2 stories high, the winter garden still features tropical plants beneath glass skylights. The house has become what it could never be while the family lived there, fully a monument to a vanished world. The estate operates as a profitable business. Admission fees generate more than $100 million in annual revenue. The property includes hotels, restaurants, a winery, and retail operations. Employment exceeds 2,000 people, making Biltmore one of the largest employers in western North Carolina. The house that consumed George Vanderbilt's fortune now generates substantial income for his descendants and provides economic benefits to the surrounding region. The financial model represents the only viable path for preserving Gilded Age mansions. Private residential use proved economically impossible. Only by transforming into tourist attractions, museums, or institutional facilities could these structures survive. Biltmore succeeded where most others failed because the family adapted early, opening to tourists in 1930 when commercial tourism was still developing as an industry. The experience of visiting Biltmore today reveals what has been preserved and what has been lost. Tourists wander through rooms that once accommodated only family guests and servants. They photograph spaces where the Vanderbilts lived their private lives. They examine furnishings and art collections that were never meant for public display. The house has been democratized through admission fees, allowing anyone with $75 to experience rooms that George Vanderbilt built for his exclusive use. What visitors see is genuinely remarkable. The craftsmanship that built Biltmore cannot be replicated today. The stone carving, the woodwork, the ceiling details, the technological systems all represent skills and techniques that have largely disappeared from American construction. Modern building codes, labor costs, and architectural priorities make such work prohibitively expensive, even for billionaires who could theoretically afford it. The scale itself astonishes. Walking through Biltmore requires hours. The distances between rooms, the heights of ceilings, the dimensions of public spaces, all exceed what modern residential architecture attempts. Contemporary luxury homes may feature expensive materials and elaborate technology, but they rarely achieve the monumental scale that defined Gilded Age construction, size for its own sake. No longer serves any practical or social purpose. The preservation success comes with costs. Biltmore is frozen in 1895, maintained as a historical exhibit rather than an evolving residence. The family members who still live on the property occupy a small section and remain invisible to tourists. The house has become a museum that happens to have descendants living in it, rather than a family home that welcomes visitors. The transformation ensured survival, but eliminated the original purpose. The comparison to demolished mansions reinforces how fortunate Biltmore's preservation was. Of the hundreds of comparable houses built during the Gilded Age, fewer than a dozen survive. In anything approaching original condition, the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue are gone. The Palmer Mansion in Chicago is gone. Dozens of Newport cottages are gone. San Francisco lost virtually everything in the 1906 earthquake and subsequent development. Most American cities retain perhaps one or two examples of Gilded Age domestic architecture, usually preserved through donation to museums or conversion to institutional use. What was lost architecturally represents more than just buildings. An entire approach to construction disappeared. The Gilded Age produced craftsmen who specialized in stone carving, decorative plasterwork, hand-forged metalwork, and other skills that required years of apprenticeship. To master these trades, sustained communities of artisans who passed techniques across generations. When mansion construction ended, these skills largely vanished. Modern construction employs different methods, different materials, and different labor structures. The knowledge of how to build a Biltmore has been substantially lost. The cultural loss is harder to quantify. Gilded Age mansions represented a particular approach to wealth, one that valued permanent physical monuments over financial instruments. Vanderbilt built Biltmore to stand for centuries, to house generations of descendants, to serve as a visible testament to family achievement. He invested enormous resources in something that generated no financial return, but created aesthetic and cultural value that tourists still appreciate more than a century later. Modern billionaires make different choices. Their wealth flows into foundations, media properties, technology platforms, and investment portfolios that generate returns and exercise power. These instruments are more financially rational than mansions. They preserve and grow wealth rather than consuming it. They influence policy and shape society in ways that buildings cannot, but they create nothing that will draw tourists a century from now. The tax system that destroyed mansion economics funded genuine public goods. The revenue from progressive taxation built highways, schools, hospitals, and social programs that benefited millions of Americans. The Gilded Age concentrated wealth in the hands of a tiny elite, while leaving the majority of the population with limited access to education, healthcare, or economic opportunity. The tax reforms of the early 20th century redistributed resources in ways that created broader prosperity and social stability. Yet something was lost in the trade. The visible inequality of Gilded Age America was offensive, but it was visible. Everyone could see the mansions, identify their owners, and organize politically. To challenge concentrated wealth, Ida Tarbell investigated Standard Oil because the company was large enough to be noticed. Labor unions organized against industrialists whose palaces demonstrated their wealth. Progressive politicians mobilized public anger. At ostentatious displays of excess, modern inequality is worse. By most measures, the wealth gap between the richest Americans and the median household exceeds Gilded Age levels, but the inequality is less visible. Billionaires hide behind LLCs, foundations, and geographically dispersed holdings. They exercise power through platforms and media properties that most people do not recognize as instruments of concentrated wealth. The system is harder to challenge, because it is harder to see the case for visible wealth is not aesthetic or moral, it is practical. When inequality is visible, democratic societies can respond to it. Voters can demand taxation. Legislators can regulate monopolies. Journalists can investigate abuses. The system remains accountable because the evidence of concentrated power cannot be hidden. When inequality becomes invisible, accountability becomes more difficult. How does one investigate a foundation's influence over public health policy? How does one regulate a platform's control of information flow? How does one tax wealth that is distributed across hundreds of legal entities and dozens of jurisdictions? The modern ultra-wealthy have learned to exercise power without creating monuments that document that power. They have solved the problem that destroyed Gilded Age mansions by making their wealth and influence harder to perceive. The central question remains unresolved. Is modern invisibility better than Gilded Age ostentation? The answer depends on what aspects of wealth concentration concern you most, if the concern is wastefulness. Modern efficiency is clearly superior. Billionaires who invest in productive assets rather than building 250-room houses allocate capital more rationally. Society benefits from investments in technology, research, and business development. More than from additional palaces, if the concern is inequality itself, the comparison is less favorable. Wealth concentration has increased, not decreased. The ultra-wealthy control a larger share of total assets than they did in the Gilded Age. The tax system that destroyed mansions has been progressively weakened through lobbying and political influence. Top marginal rates have fallen from 94% to 37%. Estate taxes have been reduced substantially. The system that forced Biltmore to become a museum is weaker than at any point since the 1920s. If the concern is accountability, modern invisibility creates serious problems. Power that operates through foundations, platforms and media properties is harder to challenge than power that built visible palaces. The ultra-wealthy shape education policy, health policy, environmental policy, and media discourse without the public oversight. That democratic systems require foundations operate in perpetuity with minimal transparency. Platforms control information flow with limited regulation. The concentration of power has increased. Even as the visibility of that power has decreased, Biltmore stands as evidence of both what was lost and what was gained. The house is beautiful, impractical, wasteful, impressive, offensive, and culturally valuable simultaneously. It represents an era when the wealthy built monuments to themselves that tourists now pay to see. It demonstrates craftsmanship that modern construction rarely attempts. It proves that concentrated wealth, however objectionable, can create things of lasting aesthetic value. But Biltmore also demonstrates that such monuments cannot be sustained. George Vanderbilt built his château to last centuries. It survives not because his descendants maintained it as a private residence, but because they transformed it into a commercial enterprise. The house endures by becoming something its builder never intended. The lesson applies beyond architecture. The billionaires stopped building Biltmores because the world forced them to evolve. Whether they evolved into something better or merely something less visible remains an open question. Modern wealth is more rationally deployed, more strategically protected, and more politically influential than Gilded Age fortunes. It is also less accountable, less visible, and harder to challenge through democratic processes. Standing on Biltmore's terrace, looking across the Blue Ridge Mountains that George Vanderbilt surveyed more than a century ago, visitors see a landscape that appears timeless. The forests have grown. The approach road winds through trees that were planted generations ago. The view stretches for miles in every direction, just as it did when Vanderbilt chose this hilltop for his mansion. The house still stands because it transformed the fortune that built it, dispersed. Because it could not be protected, the world that made such construction possible ended definitively within 2 decades of Biltmore's completion. Nothing comparable will be built again, not because Americans lack ambition or wealth, but because the incentives have changed completely. Whether future generations will visit museums dedicated to charitable foundations, tour the preserved headquarters of defunct platforms, or examine the archives of 21st-century media empires remains uncertain. These institutions may exercise more power than Biltmore ever did, but they will leave fewer monuments for tourists to photograph.